They used to be obscure, but today on international news you will hear a lot about Salafi Muslims. They won about 25% of the seats in the new Egyptian parliament last year. In 2012, they took over northern Mali in the African Sahara, imposed strict Islamic law, and destroyed World Heritage sites in Timbuktu. And the Muslims who rule Saudi Arabia are part of the Salafi tradition. But how you define a so-called Salafi Muslim depends on whom you ask. Today we'll find out who they are, what they believe, and whether we should be worried about this growing Islamic movement. Here to help us understand is Yasir Qadhi, an expert on Salafi Islam, who is an adjunct professor at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. He is also the Dean of Academic Affairs for the Al-Maghrib Institute, the largest school for Islamic studies in North America, with 35 locations around the world. And he joins us today from Memphis, Tennessee. Welcome to Interfaith Voices, Yasir.
Thank you for having me.
Now, first, what is your own relationship to Salafi Islam?
Well, I guess 20 years ago when I was a teenager, I definitely would have self-identified as a Salafi Muslim. But over the course of the last decade or so, I've kind of sort of grown out of the movement now.
What does that mean, grown out of the movement?
I found the movement is not as intellectually stimulating as I would like it to be. I think that it's not really capable of addressing modern issues. It's very intransigent in the way it views certain ideas. It's also very hostile to any who disagree with its interpretation. So I find myself disagreeing with quite a lot of the methodological issues associated with the Salafi movement.
Do you remember what attracted you to it to begin with?
Yes, of course. It was a number of factors. First and foremost, it was the empowerment of being able to understand your religion straight from the texts of the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet. This is a sense of liberation where you're not dependent upon a group of clerics and you have no idea why they're saying what they're saying. The Salafi tradition always challenged people to think about why particular clerics are saying their particular positions, and it challenged people to find the evidences for every single Islamic opinion. And therefore, what it did was it allowed Muslims to reconnect to their tradition. It also allowed Muslims to separate a lot of what was culture from that which was religion. And so a lot of things were dismissed as being cultural. For example, certain dress codes or treatment of women or other things of this nature could be dismissed as being cultural practices, and people were told to embrace a more authentic or a more pure or a more pristine understanding of the faith.
And so to understand this more deeply, Salafi Islam, as I understand it, is an attempt to go back to the earliest days of Islam. Is that true?
Yes, the term Salafi actually comes from Salaf, which means the first generations. And in the context of Salafi Islam, it means the first 3 generations of the Islamic tradition. And therefore we go back to the very first 150 to 200 years of Islam. And that time period is considered to be a type of romantic past, a nostalgic element of purity that is missing in today's world. Salafis look back to that time in order to gain spiritual guidance, in order to obtain theological views, viewing that era as having been protected from later developments, from corruption, from pollution, viewing that era as being pristine and pure. And therefore, Salafis consider themselves as following the Salaf, which is the first 3 generations of Islam.
And it also then encourages people to read the Quran directly and to make their own interpretations and understandings of it.
Well, that's the whole point. That's one of the reasons why it's so popular, and that is that the Salafis are told to go back to the tradition, to read the book critically, and to engage with the text of the Prophet traditions, to look up exactly what the Prophet said. Don't just trust a cleric who tells you. Go look it up yourself. Go find the book. Go look up it's called hadith, and hadith means the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad himself. Go challenge your local clerics, and don't just take their cultural version of Islam. Go discover the authentic, the original version. And that's, again, the appeal of Salafi Islam to many people.
What you're saying about wanting to establish a direct relationship with God and not using intermediaries sounds a lot like what the Protestants at the time of the Reformation wanted in Europe.
Oh, but that's exactly the point. Salafis are the Protestant Reformation of Sunni Islam. There's no question about it that Salafis view themselves as the Protestant Reformation. They're purifying the syncretic practices that crept into the faith over the many centuries, in the exact same manner that Martin Luther viewed himself as purifying a cultural, corrupted Christianity, a Christianity from his eyes that had been corrupted by the church, by culture, by popular practices and customs. Salafis want to get rid of all of that baggage and return to the original pristine Islam as practiced by the first 3 generations of Islam.
What would that look like in the modern world?
Frankly, I think that is a question that no Salafi has answered in a very realistic manner. And this was one of the main reasons that I myself found myself distancing myself from the movement, that this type of cliched rhetoric that we want to go back to the first 3 generations, what exactly does that mean in a modern world? I don't think that any Salafi really has a concrete clue as to how that will take place.
But what are some examples of things that Salafi Muslims are doing that, for them, they say harken back to those centuries?
Primarily, they are teaching a theology, a doctrine that they feel is pure. And what this means is they are preaching against mysticism, against superstitious issues. They feel that their perception of the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet is the only correct interpretation of the faith. And so by preaching this doctrine to other Muslims, this is, they feel, the primary methodology of reviving the true spirit of the faith.
Now, I want to situate Salafi Islam in the larger Muslim world, and typical Americans will often hear about Sunnis and Shias. What's the relationship of Salafis to either of these kind of large, we think of them as denominations often in Islam?
Salafis are a trend within Sunni Islam. So all Salafis are Sunni, not all Sunnis are Salafi. Salafis are a trend, and what that means is that there are a set of doctrinal issues that all Salafi movements will agree to. Most importantly is that unique relationship that Salafis have directly with God. There's a strong emphasis on directly reaching out to the divine without the medium, without the intermediary of saints or of righteous people. And again, there's this notion of empowerment, and in particular, when it comes to worship, when it comes to prayer, when it comes to invoking, Salafis insist that only God can be petitioned for one's needs. To go to any other saint or to go to any other intermediary is tantamount to associating partners with God. So this is the primary doctrinal issue upon which all Salafi movements agree. Within this trend, there are multiple movements within Salafi Islam that disagree about many issues, and in particular issues of politics and issues of militancy. You have pacifist Salafis, you have militant Salafis. You have Salafis that wish to get involved with the political system. You have Salafis that think getting involved with the political system corrupts one's soul and one's spirituality. So Salafi Islam is a trend and not one monolithic movement.
Now, the Muslims of Saudi Arabia are often called Wahhabi Muslims. Do they fit into the Salafi tradition somehow?
Yes, they do. The Wahhabi phenomenon is Salafism in a particular geographic setting. In the 17th century, a certain tribe basically took over Saudi Arabia, and that's the tribe of the Saud, the Al Saud, which is what's called Saudi Arabia, and they allied themselves with a particular Salafi cleric by the name of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, hence the term Wahhabi. And this, if you like, alliance is in effect to this day, where the Al Saud or the Saudis are ruling and the Wahhabi clerics or the descendants of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab are in charge of the religion. So Wahhabi Islam is a version of Salafi Islam which has had a political manifestation at a time and place in recent Islamic history.
Now, given this incredibly diverse landscape that you've just painted for us, what does the Western media often misunderstand about Salafi Muslims?
I'd like to just mention two particular points. Number one, the notion that Salafis are monolithic, that they're all the same. Nothing could be further from the truth. Salafi Islam is very much like the term Protestant Christianity. There are certain things that all Protestants would agree to, and then there's quite a lot of diversity within Protestant Christianity. Definitely the evangelicals are not exactly the same as, let's say, the Episcopalians, yet they are both Protestant in nature. Similarly, Salafis do have a very broad spectrum that distinguishes various trends within Salafi Islam. That's the first point. The second point is the association of violence and terrorism to all Salafi Muslims. The fact of the matter is that most Salafi Muslims are actually apolitical. They don't get involved in politics, much less violence, because they view politics, they view the very notion of running for office or voting for people as somehow corrupting one's spirituality. They're somewhat isolationist when it comes to these issues. So far from being militant, most Salafis have nothing to do even with politics.
But I found it interesting, during the Arab Spring, the Salafis in Egypt told their voters before the Arab Spring that voting was heretical, but then after the Arab Spring happened and there was a parliamentary election, they said voting was a jihad. Therefore, Salafi Muslims should get involved. So views on the particulars of politics can change.
And that's exactly my point, that right before the Arab Spring, most Egyptian Salafis were so apolitical, they actually told their followers not even to participate in public demonstrations. They just said, mind your own business, go to the mosque, purify yourself, give charity to the poor. And yet, after the Arab Spring, when they saw the power vacuum and they realized that if they don't get involved with the political process, they cannot blame anyone but themselves if the laws do not reflect their views. When they realize that democracy means that people who are interested to effect a positive change in society have to get involved in propagating the laws of society, all of a sudden most Salafis of Egypt did an amazing about turn. And frankly, there's a positive message to be extracted from that, and that is that Salafis can change. Salafis can adapt to the changing circumstance. And Salafis actually became very politically active in a very positive manner in that, and they actually said that participating in democracy is a religious duty. They said it's a jihad, it's a religious duty to go and vote for the candidates you believe in. And that's a very positive change.
Now, before we go deeper into the questions of theology here, I wanted to talk for a second about your own background. You're an instructor at the Al-Maghrib Institute, which teaches Salafi theology in, I think, something like 21 American cities. One of your students at one time was Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, who was the so-called underwear bomber who tried to blow up a plane on Christmas Day in 2009. And a lot of our listeners would want to know, did you teach something in your classes that might have inspired him to do this?
I've been teaching for the Al-Maghrib Institute for over almost a decade now, and I have taught close to 20,000 students across North America and Europe. And I think it's not accurate to portray one loose cannon as somehow being linked to us or to myself. I barely knew Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, and the FBI, of course, did a very thorough background check of Umar Farouk after this incident, and they interviewed all of us, and we willingly cooperated. And they themselves said that Umar Farouk went through a number of phases, and he initially started practicing Islam. He attended one or two of our seminars, and he then went to Yemen, where he associated with the radical cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, who was the American cleric that was killed in a drone attack by our government a year and a half ago. And that was where he was exposed to radical jihad, and that was in Yemen with the cleric Anwar al-Awlaki. The FBI, our own government, cleared us completely. Our classes are public, and we ask everybody to come and attend and see for themselves. We do not teach anything to do with jihad or with militancy. We concentrate on doctrines, we concentrate on the history, we concentrate on the issues of worship and rituals. It's a very standard Islamic seminar.